Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Rose Kent is here. This is her, I don't know, third or fourth time, I think.
Something like that.
She was in the first class at Annapolis that had women at the Naval Academy.
One of the first. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think the last time you were here, you told the story how you were the only woman on the battleship Missouri, was it?
The USS Iowa.
USS Iowa.
That's
She
right.
had
Yeah.
So she told some good stories last time, so maybe she'll mention some. But she's also currently, she writes novels, young adult novels, YA novels. And it also says here, a former corporate executive. I haven't heard any stories of that, of that world of yours. But so this book is not brand new. It's a couple years old. It was also a PBS documentary. It's about the women in the third world. So is it all third world? In third world countries, how they're treated. And it's called Half the Sky, Turning Oppression into Opportunity for Women Worldwide. And the authors are a husband and wife team, Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times and his wife, Sheryl WuDunn. I think that's her name. So it's Half the Sky. So here's Rose Kent to tell us about this book.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. What does it mean to be a woman or a girl in poor parts of the world? This is the question that Nick Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn address in the book Half the Sky. Well, they give us two answers. The first is grim and disturbing. To be a woman or a girl means to be subject to brutality, rape, dangerous childbirth, and murder, simply because of your gender. That's the way it is. The second answer, though, is full of promise. It tells us that these very same women and girls hold the greatest potential for significantly improving the economies and the quality of life in their communities, if they are given the chance that starts with an education. Women have the potential to hold up half the sky, to borrow from the book's title, which comes from a Chinese proverb. First, I want to just give you a little bit of background on Half the Sky. Half the Sky, of course, is a best-selling book, but it's grown into much more than that. It was made into an award-winning documentary. Has anybody here seen it? Okay, a couple, yeah. It was narrated by the book's authors, and it was filmed in 10 different countries. Hollywood celebrities traveled along as the film drew us into the lives of women who have experienced oppression and overcome. Half the Sky has also been turned into classroom curriculum, educational tools, social networking games, and a Facebook game with the purpose of educating people on women's issues worldwide. There are also now Half the Sky local grassroots groups throughout the US, including here in the Capital District, all with the goal of finding ways to do something about this fight to end oppression. A little about the authors. Nick Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn have traveled the world extensively, as Joe mentioned, as New York Times correspondents. They have a lot of experience on issues of global poverty, health, and gender. They were also the first married couple to ever be awarded the Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of China. And Sheryl WuDunn is the first Asian American to receive the Pulitzer. She's now a banking executive. And Nick Kristof, who has 2 Pulitzer Prizes, continues to write for the Times. So Kristof and WuDunn explained to us that they had their kind of own journey of awakening that led them to writing this book. And it started back in China in 1989, after they had first married. They moved there from the US. So they were there, and then 7 months later, they found themselves witnessing history when Chinese troops opened fire in Tiananmen Square and gunned down hundreds of lives. So then the following year, while they were still living in China, they came across an obscure demographic study that shocked them. The study found that 39,000 baby girls had died annually in rural China because their parents didn't get them the same medical care that boys got. And that was just in the first year of life. So they did the math on this, and they realized that as many infant girls died unnecessarily every week in China as protesters died in Tiananmen Square. And yet these little baby girls didn't get any news coverage. So with more research, Kristof and WuDunn found similar patterns of women's oppression in other countries, particularly in South Asia and in the Muslim world. Abuses against women that range from female infanticide, like in China, where families kill their own babies because they don't perceive them as having the same value as boys, to rape, sex trafficking and forced prostitution, female genital cutting, grossly inadequate maternal health, and honor killings and more. So after studying the global situation and looking at the statistics, the authors drew the conclusion that, quote, it appears that more girls have been killed in the last 50 years precisely because they were girls than men were killed in all the battles of the 20th century. So this is hardly a book of light reading. It's more of a call to recruit each and every reader into this movement to help women. And not just because it's the right thing to do from a human rights movement standpoint, but also because all the data shows that investing in girls and women earns the highest return of investment. I'm going to talk about 3 areas of oppression today. The book goes into even more, but I'm going to focus on 3 today. The first is sex trafficking and forced prostitution. The second is gender-based violence. And the third is maternal morbidity. I'll be talking about difficult topics, topics that are upsetting and awkward. The authors say that we have to raise awareness and talk about these issues. And one strength of this book, I believe, is that for every dark topic it tackles, it gives us a hopeful, up-and-close profile of a woman who has dealt with the situation and overcome it. I plan on saving a little time at the end, too, so you know if you have any questions or comments. But if you just absolutely have to ask a question as we're going, please feel free to raise your hand. So the first area, sex trafficking, forced prostitution. In this year, 2013, young girls are still being sold into sex slavery at ages as young as 8 and 9, and few are doing anything about it. Why? Because the victims come from the poorest of poor, peasants, where they are perceived as human beings with zero value, no different than the slaves in the 19th century. In fact, the book actually tells us that the whole term sex trafficking is a misnomer. The problem really isn't sex or prostitution alone. And the problem isn't necessarily trafficking either, because forced prostitution doesn't always involve girls being transported over a distance. I think the problem can best be understood by calling it what it really is, slavery. Kristof and WuDunn tell us that they initially thought that prostitution was something that women turned to by their own choice out of economic desperation. But the truth is that millions of women have no choice. They are enslaved at young ages. The authors conservatively estimate that there are 3 million women and girls worldwide who are forced into the sex trade. Now understand what that means. These girls are considered the property of another person, and as such could be killed by the owners without any legal accountability. And that figure, that 3 million, that doesn't include millions more in prostitution under age 18 who can't consent, or others who have been intimidated into the field but may not necessarily be slaves. So what is that like, a life of sex bondage? Well, the book introduces us to Meena. Meena is a former sex slave who escaped. She's from Bihar in northern India. I'm going to read you a little bit of Meena's story from the book. I was 8 or 9 when I was kidnapped and trafficked, she begins. She's from a poor family on the Nepal border and was sold to a clan, then taken to a house where the brothel owner kept little girls until they were mature enough to attract customers. When she was 12, she was taken to the brothel. They brought in the first client and they'd taken lots of money from him, Meena recounted. I started fighting and crying out so that he couldn't succeed. I resisted so much that they had to return the money to him. And they beat me mercilessly with a belt, with sticks, with iron rods. She shook her head to clear her memory. But even then, I resisted. They showed me swords and said they would kill me if I didn't agree. 4 or 5 times they brought customers in, and I still resisted, and they kept beating me. Finally, they drugged me. Meena and the other girls were never allowed out of the brothel and were never paid. They typically had 10 or more customers a day, 7 days a week. And if a girl fell asleep or complained of a stomachache, the issue was resolved with a beating. She describes how the brothel owners tried hard to break her spirits because once a girl is broken, all hope squeezes out of her and force isn't necessary to get her to do what they want. She may smile and laugh as men pass by, but she is empty on the inside. Well, fortunately, Mina's story took a hopeful turn when she escaped the brothel, and she was able to make a new life for herself. She credits her stubbornness and help from an aid agency in the area, but this was very difficult, and she's really the exception to the rule as far as starting a life new for those who are lucky enough to escape. Women like Mina are shunned once they have been sex slaves, and often their own communities and even their own families don't want anything to do with them. And another problem in this area, too, is what's called the Stockholm Syndrome, which is basically a psychological condition in which hostages choose to stay with their captors, similar to what we read a little bit about in Cleveland with that man who kept those women captive. After years of abuse, the only life that these girls in the brothels know is the one inside the brothel. So given a chance to escape and without mental health counseling, they often return on their own. Some of the girls have also become drug addicts because of the drugs that they've been given, and so they return to the brothel for more drugs. So what can be done about sex trafficking? Well, the authors say a lot. First, they examine the politics of prostitution. They tell us that there are some people who advocate that prostitution should be legal. Those on the left often refer to prostitutes non-judgmentally as sex workers and tend to be kind of okay with transactions between consenting adults. The right, joined by some feminists, argues that prostitution is inherently demeaning and offensive. The authors say the problem with this political bickering, though, is that it does nothing to stop what everybody knows is horrible: forced prostitution involving innocent children. Well, Half the Sky's authors admit that at one time they agreed with this opinion that legalization might not be a bad idea. I mean, after all, alcohol prohibition didn't stop alcohol use in America in the 20s, and they felt that it might be the same with prostitution. Instead of banning it, they thought it might be better to regulate it, legalize it, and then regulate it. And doing that might allow healthcare workers access to the brothels to check on the girls' age and maybe to distribute condoms and curb the spread of AIDS. They have since changed their minds, though, because the situation hasn't gotten better for women in countries where prostitution is legal. In these areas, governments don't do a good job regulating the brothels and checking on the girls. So the authors suggest what they call a big stick approach to prostitution. This would mean keeping it illegal and having crackdowns to check the brothels. They feel that they can free some girls with this if it's combined with job retraining and drug rehabilitation. They emphasize, along with this, though, that they have to have strong law enforcement strategies that push for change in police attitudes and regular police inspections. Because in some of these countries, police do absolutely nothing for the girls. And in fact, girls who do try to get away, when they go to the police, that they are either raped or they are brought back to the brothels where the police collect bribes. The big stick approach advocates for holding governments accountable not just to pass laws against underage prostitution, but also to enforce the laws and monitor how many brothels are raided and how many pimps are arrested. And they give us the example of Sweden as a place where they've taken this approach and they've had some success. The book also tells us that international pressure does help in limiting sex trafficking. It refers to a report that our US State Department released starting in the year 2000, which is called the Trafficking in Persons Report. And the report actually ranks countries on how well they are handling the issue of trafficking, and those that come out poorly get sanctioned. Governments don't like this when other nations look at them, and it motivates them to do a little more investigating and shutting down brothels. We also get an example in the book of a village in Cambodia called Ve Pak, where this happened. It used to be one of the worst places in the world for sex slavery. Girls there were often as young as 7 or 8 years old. But then after the trafficking report came out, the government got a lot of grief, and they decided that the bribes weren't worth it. So they've cracked down a lot there, and you don't see as many young girls. Kristof and WuDunn acknowledge that we will never completely eliminate the problem of prostitution. I mean, it's called the world's oldest profession, right? But crackdowns and exposure can lead to the closing down of some of the worst brothels. And it will almost certainly reduce the number of 14-year-old girls who are literally held in cages at some of these brothels until they die of AIDS. And they tell us that child sex trafficking is actually getting worse, not better. It used to be, back in the day, being sold to a brothel was bad enough, but it didn't necessarily mean a death sentence. Now it often does because of AIDS. And because of the fear of AIDS, many brothel customers prefer these young girls because they believe they're less likely to be infected. So those young girls puts even more money in their brothel owners' pockets. On a local note, I thought I would point out for all of us here that we too in the US do have a problem with sex trafficking, although certainly not anywhere near in the same numbers. This surprised me when I did a little research on this. Experts say that in New York State alone, thousands of people are trafficked every year as sex slaves and farm workers, though there were just 77 arrested in the year 2012. Some of us might be familiar with the Women's Equality Act that's up before the New York legislature right now, and there actually is a provision in there to crack down on human trafficking. Because right now, human trafficking in New York State isn't even a felony. Offenders face as little as a year in prison, and the system sometimes re-injures the victims by charging them with prostitution instead of treating them as somebody who's been harmed. The second area of oppression that the book discusses is gender-based violence. How common is violence against women? Well, consider this. Surveys suggest that 1/3 of all women worldwide have been beaten at home. Women ages 15 to 44 are more likely to be maimed or die from male violence than cancer, malaria, traffic accidents, and war combined. Rape is, in fact, so common and so stigmatizing that in many countries, victims don't report it and there aren't well-kept statistics. I want to talk specifically about rape. In many poor countries, the problem isn't so much with individual attacks as it is an entire culture of sexual assaulting as the norm. And we learn this in the book from the story of a young African girl named Woinshet. Woinshet lives in a rural area of Ethiopia, where kidnapping and raping is a time-honored tradition. If a young man has an eye on a girl, but he doesn't have a bride price, which is basically the equivalent of a dowry, but paid for by a man, or if he feels the girl's family won't accept him, he and his friends kidnap the girl, and he rapes her. Ethiopian law specifically stated that a man could not be prosecuted for violating a woman he later married. Well, this is exactly what happened to Woinshet, who at the time was 13 years old, a 7th grader. We were deep asleep when they came, Woinshet recalls. I think there were 4 of them. There was no electricity, but they had a flashlight, and they broke down a door. We were shouting, but nobody heard us or came. Woinshet didn't know her kidnapper, Abaru Gemma. She had never spoken to him, but he had noticed her. For 2 days, her kidnappers casually beat and raped Woinshet. Her family and her teacher went to the police, and she did escape. But then the story gets even more complicated. Woinshet's father was horrified by what had happened to his daughter and decided that the rapist had to be held accountable. So he contacted a nonprofit law association in Addis Ababa, which is Ethiopia's capital, and they decided to prosecute. But the elders in the village she belonged to pressured the family to negotiate and settle the dispute with Gemma. That meant to accept his offering for some cattle and for Woinshet to marry him. Well, Woinshet and her father were outraged and refused and continued trying to seek justice. But in the meantime, while they waited, Abaru Gemma kidnapped and, yes, raped Woinshet again. Woinshet managed to escape again and was recaptured by her rapist, who this time took her to family court so a judge could talk some sense into her. So this tiny pint-sized girl told the judge about the abductions, and he told her, look, there is no point. Even if you go home, Abaru Gemma will go after you again. Marry him. If it weren't so horrible, it would be comical, wouldn't it? Well, the good news is Woinshet didn't marry her rapist. She wanted to stay in school, which is one reason she said why she refused to marry him. She continued with her case, a long legal case, and eventually Gemma was sentenced to 10 years for the abductions and rapes. Unfortunately, the system didn't work. He never served his sentence. So on the surface, this may feel like a hopeless story, but the authors tell us there were hopeful outcomes. Wunchet didn't succumb to tradition and marry her rapist. Her family broke taboos and stood by her, especially her father. The village took notice, and she got legal support both within her country and from human rights advocates in New York. And a law was changed. In Ethiopia today, a man is liable for rape, even if the victim later agrees to marry him. I think there's an important point made in sharing this story, and that is that we see that the law alone rarely matters in poor countries, or really in any country for that matter. The culture has to change too. Rape is also used as a weapon of mass destruction in poor countries. This has been the case in civil wars in Africa and especially in eastern Congo. The militias in the Congo have discovered that it's too risky to fight with government gunmen, so instead they assault civilians. For their purpose, mass rape is as effective as slaughtering people, only it doesn't leave bodies that can lead to prosecution. A rape counselor in Congo had this to say: "In other places, there is rape because men want women. Here, it's that, but also a viciousness, a mentality of hatred, and it's women who pay the price. We say women," the counselor added quickly, "but the victims are not adults. Often they are girls of 14, even children of 6. In just the Congolese province of South Kivu, the UN estimates that there were 27,000 sexual assaults in 1 year. By other UN accounting, 3/4 of the girls and women in some areas have been raped. Speaking about it, one UN commander had this to say: "It has probably become more dangerous to be a woman here than a soldier in an armed conflict." Keep in mind that the Congolese militia rape with sticks, knives, or bayonets, or they fire their guns inside women's vaginas. One 16-year-old soldier was quoted in the book as casually saying this about rape: "If we see a girl, it's our right. We can violate them." Well, given such brutality, one has to wonder, who can lead the way to stop such violence? The authors argue that most effective change agents are not Westerners, but local women and men, like Wunchet and her father. And they do exist in many poor countries. But the authors don't give us Westerners a pass either from getting involved, because they say that we can play a role by speaking up to the world and our own leaders, helping financially, supporting change, and shining a spotlight on these wrongdoings. In other words, saying, that's their culture, their traditions, who are we to get involved, just isn't good enough. They say the world today needs us to be global citizens who think, act, and care beyond our communities and our borders. I want to share one more story with you from the book about a young woman who rose above the trauma of rape. This one is from Pakistan. Mukhtar grew up in a peasant family in southern Punjab, in the northern region of Pakistan. She is not exactly sure of her year of birth because nobody kept track of it. And she never attended school because there was no school for girls. She spent her days helping out around the house. Then in July 2002, when she was a teen, her younger brother, Shakur, was kidnapped and gang raped by a member of a clan called the Mastoi. Shakur was 12 or 13 at the time. And after raping him, the clan got nervous that they would be punished. So they made up a story about him sexually assaulting a girl from another tribe. Because the Mastoi had accused Shakur of this, the village tribal council assembled. But the council was dominated by members of the clan. And they decided at this meeting that the only suitable punishment for Shakur's alleged crime was for Mukhtar, his sister, to be gang raped. 4 men dragged her into an empty stable area immediately after the tribal meeting and raped her on the dirt floor, one after another. After doing this, Mukhtar was pushed out of the stable and forced to stumble home half naked. Once at home, she prepared to do what any Pakistani peasant woman would normally do in that situation: kill herself. Suicide is the expected way for a woman to cleanse herself and her family from such a shame. But Mukhtar's parents wouldn't let her. And then a local Muslim leader, one of the heroes of the story, spoke up for her and denounced the rape as an outrage against Islam. Well, as the days passed, Mukhtar's attitude changed from shame to rage. She went to the police and she reported the rape, and the police, somewhat surprisingly, arrested her attackers. Then the president of Pakistan heard about her and sent her the equivalent of $8,300 in compensation to show support. This is where the story takes an interesting turn. Instead of taking the money for herself, Mukhtar decided to invest it in what her village needed most, a school for girls, and she became one of its very first students. Mukhtar's school gathered a lot of publicity, and she became somewhat of an international celebrity for talking about education for girls, which didn't go over very well back at home. Eventually, the president of Pakistan changed his mind and did not support her and said that she was embarrassing her country. She received death threats, and her family felt tremendous pressure to close the school. They refused. Mukhtar also started her own aid group, which operates a 24-hour hotline for battered women and a shelter for victims of violence. The school is still open. So the book discusses other forms of gender violence too. I won't go into all of them, but I wanted to mention two more. The first being honor killings, of which the UN estimates 5,000 occur every year. An honor killing takes place when a family kills one of its own girls because they believe she has behaved immodestly with a man. Often there is zero proof that this has happened, but it doesn't matter. The irony with honor killings, of course, is that these take place in societies with the most rigid moral codes, and yet they somehow justify murder. And bride burnings are also common in the poorer areas of India. This is where a woman is punished for not having enough in her dowry, or simply just to eliminate her so her husband can get on with things and remarry. Such a woman is doused with kerosene and set afire by a family or by her in-laws, with the government doing very little. And finally, acid attacks are on the rise in South Asia and Southeast Asia. If a man's interest in a woman isn't reciprocated, he will simply take sulfuric acid and hurl it in the woman's face, disfiguring her and causing blindness. The legal punishment is often mild, if there is any. This last area of oppression that I'm going to talk about, the authors discuss what they call a less-known form of cruelty, but no less deadly for pregnant women, and that's maternal morbidity. Maternal morbidity is the suffering and the injury and even the death from pregnancy and childbirth. But the authors say the real cause of this is global indifference. Every 90 seconds, a woman dies in pregnancy or childbirth, shattering her family and threatening the well-being of her surviving children. 90% of these mothers live in Africa and Asia. The lifetime danger of maternal death is 1,000 times higher, 1,000 times higher in a poor country than the West, and the gap is actually getting wider. And for every woman who dies in childbirth, at least 10 suffer significant injuries, like fistulas, which I'll talk about in a minute. Why does this happen? Well, it happens because women's suffering is rarely a priority in poor parts of the world. In much of the world, women don't even have the basic right to see a healthcare provider without their husband's permission. Doctors can't even perform an emergency cesarean section unless husband says okay. And as in the United States, healthcare costs money. In poor countries, the men handle the money. So when it comes to medicine and money, the priorities are clear. Women are dispensable. If a person is dispensable, their suffering doesn't matter. Another reason for such incredibly painful childbirths is that the mothers are so young. Their bodies are not ready, and the babies often get stuck in the birth canal. And again, this type of medical situation would be handled swiftly in a Western hospital with minimal suffering. The authors share the moving story of Prudence, a 24-year-old pregnant mother of 3 children in Cameroon. Prudence labored in her village for 3 days, assisted by a birth attendant with no medical training. But her cervix was blocked, and the baby wouldn't come. In an attempt to move things along, the birth attendant jumped up and down on Prudence's stomach, and her uterus erupted. So the family paid a man with a motorcycle to take her to the nearest clinic. There, the doctor, utterly lacking in compassion, told Prudence's family that she needed an emergency cesarean section. He said he would do it, but for no less than $100. Prudence's husband said that he could raise $20, and the negotiations went back and forth for 2 days. The authors came across this situation unfolding by accident. They were actually at the clinic doing research for their book when they stumbled into a room where Prudence lay suffering. Sheryl WuDunn actually donated blood and appealed to the doctor on Prudence's behalf. 2 days later, the doctor performed the cesarean section. Both Prudence and the baby died. The most common and devastating injury caused by poor maternal health, and for that matter, brutal rape, like I talked about earlier, is called a fistula. A fistula is an abnormal connection that happens between body organs, and in this case, in the woman's reproductive system. This is a devastating injury that changes women's lives forever. They are left incontinent, in pain, and they are ostracized from their villages due to the stigma and a terrible odor it causes. In many cases, their husbands divorce them, and they're forced to literally live alone in huts. It costs on average $300 to repair a fistula, and about 90% of these are, in fact, repairable. But again, the vast majority of women who suffer are poor peasants who aren't taken to a hospital. A British nurse wife who works at a fistula hospital in Ethiopia describes the fistula patient as a modern-day leper. She's helpless, she's voiceless, and the reason is because she is a woman. If this happened to men, we would have foundations and supplies coming in from all over the world, she says. The book makes a really interesting point here about the politics of maternal health, too. It notes that conservatives battle against forced abortions in China, and liberals fight passionately for abortion rights in many foreign lands. But meeting the challenge of poor, dying women in childbirth has never really had much of a constituency. But again, Nick Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn show us the harshness and then offer an uplifting profile of somebody in the trenches making changes. Two individuals, actually. The first is the late Dr. Alan Rosenfield, who was an American from Massachusetts, who served in the Korean War, and he later volunteered at a local hospital in South Korea. There he saw terrible childbirth injuries that would never have taken place in the US, and it left him with a deep interest in the medical needs of the poor, and so he created his own form of the Peace Corps. Later, with a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Dr. Rosenfield launched an organization called Averting Maternal Death and Disability, AMDD, which is a global effort to make childbirth safer. Dr. Rosenfield was an American trailblazer when he first practiced medicine abroad. Today, we hear more about this. We hear about Doctors Without Borders, who are all over the place doing good work. And we hear about Dr. Paul Farmer and Partners in Health doing a lot of good things in Haiti. But Dr. Rosenfield was the first. And he also wrapped his efforts in language that hadn't been heard of before, calling maternal death not just a public health issue, but also a human rights issue. The second person who has helped reduce maternal morbidity, and one of my favorite individuals featured in the book, is Edna Aden, the smart, stubborn, and outspoken founder of Edna's Hospital. Edna grew up in Somaliland, what is now Somaliland, in an elite family, with her father a doctor and her mother the daughter of the Postmaster General. Edna is a woman of many firsts in her country. She was the first qualified nurse wife. She was the first woman to drive a car. She was the first lady of Somalia at one point, and in fact traveled to the US and met Lyndon Johnson because she married the prime minister, but later they divorced. But having been born into privilege didn't prevent Edna from being subject to the Somalian brutal tradition of female circumcision as a young girl, otherwise known as genital cutting. In fact, it was her own mother who gave the okay for this, which is often the case for this incredibly painful and dangerous practice. This trauma is what inspired Edna to become a fierce advocate for women's health. So she spent a career working for the World Health Organization in Africa, which earned her a lovely office and a Mercedes-Benz. But she didn't want her legacy to be a car. So she retired from the World Health Organization, sold her Mercedes, and used the money to build a hospital in the Horn of Africa, specifically for poor women. Of course, the car money didn't go far enough, so Edna worked tirelessly to build a group of financial supporters called Friends of Edna, both in Africa and in the United States. Reading about Edna and the hospital she built is inspiring. First of all, she upset all the protocols about construction in Somalia by insisting the workers not chew cat, which is a leaf with amphetamine qualities that is often abused in Africa. When the workers didn't take her, a woman, serious, she fired them. Then Edna insisted that the masons teach women how to make bricks. They again resisted until they realized that she was paying the bills, and soon Somaliland had its first women brickmakers. The result is a gleaming 3-story hospital that surprises those who see it and are more familiar with broken-down hospitals in Africa. Edna's hospital has the hygiene and efficiency of a Western hospital. It has 60 beds and 76 staff members, and Edna lives in an apartment within the hospital so she can always be on call. Edna's hospital routinely waives payment demands from the poor. She accepts no salary. Let me read you a brief description of what goes on inside the hospital. At 3 o'clock one morning, a man arrived pushing his wife in a wheelchair. A man arrived pushing his wife in a wheelbarrow. She was in labor. The team leaped into action and rushed the woman into the delivery room. Another time, a nomadic woman gave birth in the desert and developed a fistula. Her husband couldn't stand her smell and constant wetness and stabbed her in the throat. The knife went through her tongue and stopped at her palate. The other nomad stitched her together with a needle and thread and carried her to Edna's hospital. A visiting fistula surgeon patched the woman together again from her throat to her bladder. And consider this. Once a man drove through the hospital's front gate with his wife in labor in the back seat. The baby emerged just as they arrived, and so the man tried to drive right out again. "No, no," Edna shouted, "you'll kill your wife. The placenta has to come out." "I won't pay you," the man shouted back. "I'm leaving." "Close the gate," Edna shouted to the guard, blocking the car from leaving. Then Edna turned to the husband. "Forget about the payment," she said, and she pulled out the placenta right there in the back seat before opening the gate and allowing him to go. What can be done? This is the question that hounds us when we hear of such mind-boggling abuse of women. Well, Half the Sky tells us that a lot more can be done on a broad level and on an individual level than we realize. And then they spell out many ways change can come. Educating girls, they say, is one of the most effective ways of fighting poverty and injustice. Because with education comes empowerment by women themselves, and that leads to change. When individuals are empowered, they stand up and they don't take the bad. But to educate girls, you have to keep them in school. And this is a problem in many poor parts of the world. So the book offers 4 cost-effective ways to increase girls' school attendance. I find these ideas fascinating. Number 1, by deworming girls. Intestinal worms kill 130,000 people around the world every year, typically through intestinal obstruction and anemia, which especially affects menstruating girls. One study in Kenya found that deworming decreased school absenteeism by 1/4. Just to give it a little perspective, Americans spend $50 a year to deworm a dog. In Africa, you can deworm a child for a year for 50 cents. Number 2, we can increase school attendance by helping poor girls manage their periods. African girls don't have feminine products available to them at schools the way Western girls do. Most girls use rags to manage their menstruation, and they often have a single pair of torn underwear, so this often keeps them at home. We can help organizations provide products and access to a toilet at school. Number 3, iodizing salt. 31% of the households in the developing world don't get sufficient salt from their water or food. The result is brain damage when babies are still in their mother's wombs. One study in Ecuador suggests that iodine deficiency knocks 10 to 15 points off a child's IQ before they're even born. It would cost just $19 million to pay for salt ionization for poor countries who need it. So like with the deworming, this is not a glamorous form of aid, but it's a bargain one that promises results. The 4th and final suggestion for increasing school attendance for girls is rarely talked about, at least not using this word. It's called bribery. In many poor countries, UN feeding programs distribute food, and local parents are the ones who provide the labor to make the daily meals. All kids get a free meal. And in some situations, girls who attend school and get good grades get an extra take-home ration. Parents like that. School feeding programs cost just 10 cents per child per day, and researchers have found that they do improve nutrition and increase school attendance, especially for girls. But funding is tight, and there are millions of children who could benefit from this and don't get it. An important point that the book repeatedly makes and backs up is that funding towards women in poor countries is a wise investment for communities and nations. Facts tell us that some of the world's most wretched suffering is caused not just by low incomes, but also by unwise spending. Men typically control purse strings in these poor families, where 10 times as much is spent on a combination of alcohol, prostitution, candy, sugary drinks, and a lavish feast than is spent on educating girls. So to get more girls in school and to save more women from dying from abuse or childbirth, one simple solution is to reallocate spending. And studies do show that when women hold the assets or gain income, family money is more likely to be spent on nutrition, medicine, and housing, and children are healthier. We can actually refer back to our own history here in America on this point, because maternal morbidity dropped considerably in the US after women gained the right to vote in 1920. And a number of important child welfare laws were also passed at that time. At the end of Half the Sky, Kristof and WuDunn spell out ways that we can join in this movement to improve women's lives worldwide. They give us ideas, they give us contact information on how we can help, where we can call, email, etc., both long-term and in the next 10 minutes. There's actually a chapter with that name, what you can do in the next 10 minutes. Yes, this is about giving money, and yes, this is about volunteering, but it's also about paying attention, speaking up, letter writing, and becoming informed with our own political process and how it impacts women worldwide. There's one suggestion that I found especially interesting was the idea of encouraging our young people in America to visit a developing country. Most colleges today have fantastic study abroad programs, and the authors challenge students to consider going to a world location that might open their eyes to how others live and suffer. They point out that Americans' lives are actually not in danger in these countries either. Americans are pretty safe. It's the locals who suffer and die. So to conclude, Half the Sky tells us that change comes from building coalitions across ideological lines. We need to stop the sparring between liberals and conservatives and work together. We need to resist the temptation to oversell humanitarian efforts because change does take time. No quick fixes. And we need to remember that helping women doesn't mean ignoring men. For example, it's crucial that more money goes towards fistula procedures. It's also important that money goes to funding male circumcision, which is proven to slow the spread of AIDS. We also can't blame men for all the oppression. There are good men in many of these countries who want change. There are men here today listening to this talk. And there are also women who are part of the problem with oppression. For example, in Southeast Asia, the most cruelest brothel owners are often the women. You must be the change you want to see in the world. That is what Gandhi said, and the quote is included in the book's end, directly appealing to the reader to not just close the book and move on, but to join the movement to stop oppression. And not to worry if our small efforts don't solve all the problems. They will make a difference. And here's a final story that the book shares to that point. The children of the Niantic Community Church in Niantic, Connecticut bought 6 goats through Heifer International as a gift to Africa. The goats are listed in the Heifer catalog at a cost of $120 each. One of these goats went to the Bira family in Uganda, near the Congo border. The goat was named Luck and lived up to its name. It promptly produced twins. The Bira children drank the goat's milk for a nutritional boost, and the parents sold some of the milk to raise extra income. They had not been able to afford to send their daughter Beatrice to school, so she stayed home and did chores all day. But with the extra income from the milk, the parents decided to send their daughter to the village school. Beatrice was 9 years old, while all the first graders were 6. But she worked hard, and she rocketed to the top of her class. She was such a strong student that she eventually won a scholarship to Uganda's best school. She became the first girl from her village to go abroad, and in 2008, she graduated from Connecticut College. Now Beatrice is working for the United Nations, And it's all because of a goat, she says. Nick Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn remind us that Beatrice is one girl. There are many more needing help. So, to use their concluding words, let's get on with it. Let's give them a hand and speed up the day when women around the world truly hold up half the sky. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I'd like to open the floor. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions or to hear comments. Yes?
One thing I wanted to know, is there a reference area in the back of the book that names organizations that we can contribute to? Because I've contributed to some of these organizations in the past, but I think it would be helpful for us to know exactly where there's a resource that lists all those organizations and tells us exactly what they do and how we can help.
Yes, there's a very good section in the back that lists all the organizations that are profiled, all the women that I shared with you, plus many, many more. Those organizations are listed. There are websites. There are phone numbers. And the thing that I really appreciated about the references is there is also an opportunity for us to establish almost a personal relationship with these organizations. There are multiple ones where you can connect with a woman. For what you donate, you will specifically get the name of a woman. Often you will hear from the woman on a regular basis to see where your money is going. There are also references in the back where you can volunteer, and they will take you for as little as 3 to 4 days. Edna's Hospital that I talked about, people go over there and have been doing that since the book first published and using a week of their vacation, because once you show up, Edna will put you to work. She is that kind of a woman. Any more questions? Yes?
Not to minimize, well, first of all, your presentation was excellent, although not very cheery, as you told us at the beginning. Not to minimize the benefit of any individual life saved by any means at all. I mean, those few success stories that you mentioned are wonderful, but my reaction is it may be a little misleading to continue this sort of drop in the bucket thing all over the place, helping one woman here, one child there in school. That's all great, but the magnitude of the problem that you presented is so enormous that a little bit of bandage, here and there may be a feel-good kind of thing, but I really wonder if it would make any progress on this enormous problem that you described. My gut reaction is that it has to be more of a top-down thing rather than a bottom-up. I mean, it's great, again, if individuals want to send money and send votes and all that stuff, but that would take forever to even make a dent in the problem that you addressed. My recollection, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she set up something, I don't remember what it was, on behalf of women. I don't know if that mentioned in the book, but it just seems to me that either the U.S. government, our elected officials, or the United Nations, or somebody like the Pope or the Dalai Lama, people way up on top have to exert unending pressure on the various governments, and I assume you could list them in order, the worst, to the less worst, to make some progress on this problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll speak for the authors, and not here, of course. I believe that they would say that it's not an either-or answer. These are complex challenges. They've been with the world for a long time, and the putting pressure on is part of that solution, and they certainly advocate a lot of time to that. Nick Kristof draws the example of the story about a man walking on the beach and seeing starfish that are all going to die, and picking a few up and putting them in the bucket. And the question is, somebody comes along and says, are you kidding me? Why are you wasting your time on one or two when all these starfish are going to die? And he says, well, what I just did mattered to that starfish. And he refers to those women, those young girls, 14-year-old girls living in cages in parts of Southeast Asia, and saying, if these efforts save one girl, we've saved one girl. But I agree with you that it does need to be a broader level, and I think the Half the Sky movement is becoming that. It's growing. As I said, it's not just a book anymore. It's no longer a book. It's not about just watching a movie and moving on. There are local groups really built up everywhere, and there is pressure in the political process to get many people involved. Thank you. Is there another hand up? Yes.
I wanted to comment on sex trafficking issue that is brought here, and I don't know how much the book addresses this, but this is certainly a very huge phenomenon. I myself have been involved with sex trafficking concerns, anti-trafficking efforts from Eastern Europe. And I think the biggest complaint that I'm hearing from the region is that this is truly not particularly only our problem that we need to deal, but the demand side that needs to be addressed, and it is the West that needs to take the blame. Educate your young men, educate your population that you are exploiting our kids, our women that are being trafficked into many of these countries. And I think this misnomer, I'm always getting a chill when somebody says that prostitution is the oldest profession. I would challenge anybody for $1 billion to find me a girl that already consciously making a decision at whatever age they decide about their career, saying, you know, when I grow up, my profession is going to be prostitution. I'm going to be a prostitute. This is what I'm going to grow up and get as a profession. Mm-hmm. So it's not a profession, and this description needs to be challenged on that. So I wonder, I guess the long and the short of this, do the authors address the complexity of sex trafficking and the primary poverty and demand that are the driving factors of
Well, they do. Good question, and they certainly do in a number of chapters. This is where we get into the politics, though, and this is where Nick Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn would say, let's get on with it. Let's work on the problem. Prostitution has been around. Names aside, it's a completely different situation when you're talking about young girls. When you're talking about sex slaves, the name is slavery. And they feel very passionate about this. There have been some things done at the government level. Has there been enough? No. Has the West done enough? No. They'll also point out, though, most of the clients, if you will, are not Westerners when it comes to some of this in these poor areas. So it's about changing culture, too. I wanted to point out, is Charlotte here today? Would you like to? Charlotte is an active member of our local Half the Sky organization, and I know that there's going to be a viewing in July about this very topic that some people might be interested in. Come on up. Nice to see you, Charlotte.
Hi, my name is Charlotte LeBron. Just as a grassroots effort, a friend of mine came to me. She had read the book, and it really changed her. She said, we have to do something. And I was like, okay. And she started researching, and I have to give her most of the credit. I'm more the cheerleader and public speaker than she is. So. But basically, we started a grassroots group here called Empower Girls to Power the World. Basically, it's advocating for girls in different parts of the world. One of the projects that we have is supporting a girls' school in a rural area in India. We're actually currently looking for sponsors for the girls. They live away from their families for the 12 years that they're there. This way, they don't become a victim of trafficking. And they're actually able to get an education and be accepted back into their families because now they have this wonderful thing called an education. And even though it sounds a little backwards, they're good marriage material. So their families are very happy about this. In our Western value system, you may not think that that's a great benefit, but for them, it is a great benefit. So if we don't put our value system on them, but just as a human, knowing that their life is better, this is why we want to do this. Another aspect of it is just doing awareness locally and internationally as much as we can. We came up with a Facebook page. Our first project was promoting another program because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We just want to promote what's already out there and let people know that it exists. It's called Free the Girls. It's a small project in Mozambique. There are approximately 15 girls. They have been human trafficking victims. They're now out of that. They're able to actually sell gently used bras it's a luxury item in Mozambique, and they're collected here in the United States and sent to them. They're able to make 5 times the local wage by just selling these bras. So they're able to support their families, and they're able to get out of harm's way as far as becoming a victim again. And the third prong of our approach, mind you, we just started this in May, is that we wanted to do some local film viewing and series. So our first one is going to be next month. It's July 18th, I believe, is Thursday, at the Linda. It's part of their Food for Thought series, and we will be showing a film there and having a discussion afterwards, and so that more and more people can know that this problem exists, not around the world, but all over the world, including your own backyard, unfortunately.
Thank you.
And I have brochures if you'd like.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that with us. So thank you. So, yes.
I was just wondering, locally and globally, is this happening in colleges, universities, and schools? Because that's where change can also happen. And
Yeah.
beginning of your life, and then your minds are made up at that time. Once we get at this age, I'm not saying this is not helpful and this is the politically and every way, but I'm just wondering what's happening on that level.
Yes, well, if you're referring to Half the Sky, this whole initiative, it is a young movement, and it is very active across college campuses and across the world. And they've just done some, the fact that they're so savvy with the social networking and the Facebook, it's very much a young person's involvement. Thank you. Any more questions? All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you.